Welcome to Season 2 of Conscious Conversations, where we aim to inspire deep and meaningful interactions that grow into a community of practice that is committed to healing, resilience, and expansion. In this season, our focus is on Africa, the fountain of humanity, the great Mother Africa, a land research is increasingly confirming to be home of the first humans to evolve. Research also confirms that early humans migrated out of Africa into Asia about 2 million years ago and into Europe about 1.5 million years ago. The long and short of it, Africa is where it started. In this season's Conscious Conversations, we speak with spiritual teachers and thought leaders about the ways in which we can unearth the wisdom of the old that calls us back to listen, learn, remember, restore, and heal. I am Mabato Monte. Welcome. African culture is vast, vibrant, and colorful. Africans are known for their warmth, vibrant culture, traditions, religions, food, art, dance, and music, among many things. While it has been decades since African countries have gained their independence from colonial rule and oppression, the legacies of colonization continue to permeate in society through different institutions and economic structures, which have had a major role in the unprogressive and unproductive ways and forms of being African people have taken up. In this conversation, we speak to Thebe Ikalafeng about the ties that continue to bind us as Africans and the ways in which we can be more deliberate in uniting the continent and its people, reimagining solutions that steer us into collective action, rebuilding an Africa alive with possibilities for all who live on it. Thebe Ikalafeng is a global African thought leader, an authoritative voice in branding in Africa. His distinguished career started over 25 years ago at Colgate-Palmolive in New York. He later became Chief Marketing Officer for Nike for Africa. Thebe has won over 75 awards in branding and marketing communication globally. He is the founder of the award-winning Brand Leadership Group, a Pan-African branding advisory firm. Brand Africa, an intergenerational movement to inspire a brand-led agenda to drive Africa's image, reputation, and competitiveness. Brand Africa 100, Africa's best brand, the widely referenced and only Pan-African survey and ranking of brands in Africa, and Africa Brand Leadership Academy to build the capacity for Africa-focused brand leadership. Born in Kimberley, South Africa, he has been to over 110 countries, every country in Africa and every continent in the world, which has enriched his appreciation for the rich diversity of the continent and state of brands across Africa and the world. Good morning, Thebe. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I know you are very busy, but I really appreciate the time you have given me and our listeners to have this conversation. You have traveled to more than 110 countries worldwide and 54 countries on the continent. I saw you've just come back from an island somewhere. How has that been like?
The travel or the island, I think the traveling has been quite an eye-opener, if you will, because it's been a reminder of what binds us together as people, not just as humans. It's been able to, for me, certainly to reflect on the connectedness of the continent, where we together and where we differ. But most importantly, it's made me alive to the opportunity that exists, and as well, and when I say opportunity, really the opportunity to lift others that exist worldwide, not just in Africa.
So you have a very interesting career. I mean, the work you've done since you started at Colgate over 25 years ago has really been pioneering. Can you please just tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from, what inspires you?
Well, I'm from born and raised in Kimberley. I went to a Catholic school my whole life. I was reflecting on it the other day that I actually spent my entire school life from kindergarten to matric in one yard. At St. Boniface Precinct Catholic school. And it's quite interesting when I reflected on this background this past week that my school was at the center of, on the right-hand side, if I'm approaching the school, on the right-hand side was a white community. On the left-hand side was an Indian community, and behind me, when I get into school, is a black community. And I'm not talking by distance; I'm talking literally neighbors like that. So it's quite interesting that how even in the midst of all that, when we were being separated, we were so connected in many ways. I mean, obviously, you know, the Catholic schools were taught by Irish and South Africans, served by Indians in the shops, and working for white people on the right-hand side. So that's where I come from. So I come from there, and I started my schooling my postgraduate schooling at Wits in Johannesburg, and finished it off in the US with an undergraduate and a master's in marketing business strategy, if you will. And then much later, recently, I then did another master's in law. So that's really my big, if you will, my foundational background. One of four kids, raised by grandparents. I don't know how much that shapes anybody else's life, because, you know, as a township kid, we all grow up with migrant parents, where your parents are, even if it's professional migrants, because my mother's a professional migrant, a nurse who lives in another part of town, get to see her only once a quarter, or best once every second, or twice a year. So that shaped who I am. It shaped a lot of who I am in terms of the fact that even growing up, I participated in so many things. I was trying to list them the other day that I did chess, I did choir, I did piano, I did violin, I did choral, I did sprinting, I did football, I did tennis. And I never quite looked at any of those as failures when I left them. I looked at them rather as just tick boxes to look at what I'm good at and what I'm not good at, or rather what I'm passionate about and what I'm not passionate about. And it had to shape how I approach all of life. To approach all of life without fear of trying anything new, and without looking back at anything as a failure.
Talking about what the things you're passionate about, it's quite clear that you are very passionate about Africa. I mean, before it became popular to travel Africa, you had been traveling Africa. You had been advocating for Africa. What inspired that?
What's interesting about this is by 2009, I was asked to reflect on what it is that we need to do differently for the continent in order for us to change the image of the continent. And I remember at that point in 2009 or 8, I then started thinking, yes, what is it about this continent? What should we do? What is so difficult about this continent? And I started looking at the parallels. I wrote an article on the parallels between how the world sees us and how we can see ourselves. How the world sees us as a place to extract minerals and kill each other to get the diamonds and all those. But the parallel should really be, why can't we look at ourselves as a place that has produced the most precious stones in the world? So looking at the opportunity rather than the negative consequence of where we are. So I really started looking at that. I spent time to write that article to reflect on all those, and I started reflecting on what other Africans were saying. I looked at, I think one of the quotes I used there was by Fela Kuti, who said, I must identify with Africa, then I'll have an identity. So there was a rising consciousness, because I've been out of corporate now at that stage for 7 years or so. And there was a rising consciousness in terms of what the continent means. But I've been to part of the continent. I've been to Burkina Faso in the 19-something to watch Bafana Bafana play. I've been to Kenya. I've been to Nigeria. So I've been to parts of the continent already. But I was not so invested. But I guess I looked at the continent those years as us versus them, like the rest of the South Africa does. I looked at, oh my goodness, we are so advanced, we are so far, we are so much better. But when I began to write that article, I began to change as a person, to begin to say that maybe it's not us versus them, because whatever happens to an African anyway, it affects all Africans everywhere. And the perceptions are certainly around that. And then the second one was when I was asked to write an article in 2012 or 2013 about brands in the continent. And to do that, I then decided, let me do an interview with Samsung. And I did an interview with the CEO of Samsung. And I met him at his office. KK Park was his name. And KK Park, and I said to KK Park, what makes you so successful? You've been everywhere in the continent. So I said, your brand is everywhere in the continent. Everybody's got a Samsung. You've displaced a Nokia as the dominant phone in the continent. And he said to me, I said, what makes you successful? He said, what makes me successful is because me as a Korean serving African consumers, I've decided that it's important for me to know the continent. And it said to me, he told me that he'd been to every single African country. He explained to me how he did it. He said to me, I've lived with them, I ate with them, I slept in the houses, I watched the lights go down, and I didn't blame it on incompetence of government, but rather I looked at the opportunity of God to provide solar energy. And I says, why don't our products rather respond to the conditions and use the resources that are available? And I left the meeting and I spoke to my friend Omar in London. I said, Omar, I've just met somebody who has been to every country. You and I have just done less. I say, how many have you done? He says, done 23. I said, geez, I've only done like 10 or 15. We need to do something, Omar. I don't feel like an African, because the whole Korean is more African than me. He's got a better perspective of the continent. And those two, if you will, instances began to shape who I am. And then the third one, actually, maybe there will be three. The third one will be Thabo Mbeki. When Thabo Mbeki did his speech in 2003 for the South African tourism in Durban. He did it in Durban, and he spoke and he painted such a beautiful picture of the continent. And he said if he had time to travel the continent, he will. And he started talking about he'll go to the Ngorongoro craters, and I was like, Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, what is that? You know, he'll go to the home of Sachi Barkman in Eastern Cape. He'll go to the sand dunes of Namibia, and I was like, wow. I was like, he painted such a beautiful picture of the continent. I said to myself, I want to see that continent that he sees, because I want to see it the way he sees it. So those experiences in many ways began to change how I look at the continent, and inspired me to travel a journey, which ultimately then I decided, first I must immerse myself in the continent, understand it, and never carry South Africa with me and leave South Africa behind. And then secondarily, then I asked myself, what is it that I do every day? And I said, but I'm in the business of brand. So I said, why can't I use the work that I do as a vehicle to change the continent? So that's how I then went on this brand-led African Renaissance.
It's quite interesting that from what you are saying, I can almost extract like 3 different areas where, as an African young woman, I feel like we fall short. The South Africans do have this tendency of thinking that it's them and us when looking at other countries on the continent. How do you think we can overcome the them and us narrative? I mean, we see it, well, I see it all the time. You go on Twitter and we can see it. any violent thing happens and fellow Africans are like blamed for it. You look at the level of unemployment in the country, right? South Africans feel that certain foreigners, in inverted commas, are taking their jobs. So from an economic point of view, we see just how disconnected we are, how we are not seeing each other's struggles as a collective struggle, because people who are leaving their countries are obviously coming to South Africa hoping for better opportunities, right? Hoping for better living conditions, and South Africans are also feeling aggrieved to say, but we are also struggling. These are our issues. That's number one. Number two, you spoke about taking pride in the resources, the natural resources that we have as a continent. I always wonder, why is it from a South African perspective that we've got great resources, gold, diamonds, they get extracted from our land and they're taken abroad, and we have to buy them back at more than double the value. There is no skills transfer from those who are acquiring these resources from Africa. Why is our government not, or the continent not, prioritizing things like beneficiation of some sort? Why are we not prioritizing investors teaching South Africans or investing in the people and not only taking? And I see this across the continent. I also picked up that, the Commonwealth is returning some of the resources taken many years ago from the continent. So these are economic issues that cause so much fighting, like so much scarcity amongst us as Africans. How do we fix that? How do we correct? How do we see each other differently? And then how do we reclaim our economic wealth?
Well, I think let me answer the two questions, or two or three questions. The first one is in terms of how we the us versus them scenario. I think, to me, the reason South Africans, for example, have this mentality of us versus them, it's perhaps a combination of few things. One is I'll call it amnesia. So South Africa has forgotten how it achieved its freedom. It's forgotten that it achieved its freedom through the humanity, the sacrifice of countries such as Zambia, through Kenya Kaunda, the sacrifice of the Nigerias, of the Tanzanias, and many other countries which which contributed to the struggle, both physically in terms of providing armaments, providing accommodation, but also in terms of spiritually and mentally by encouraging, by being out there and telling the story and fighting for story. So there's an amnesia on the South African side. But I think that amnesia has been caused primarily by the failure of the South African leadership to inculcate or to create or to incorporate into our curricula the history of South Africa, so that it becomes an ever consciousness in terms of how the struggle was won, so that everybody then gets to understand the connectedness or the contribution of the rest of the continent to South Africa. So that's the first part. The second part is the entitlement. Is because South Africa is a nanny state with almost 70% dependent on the state. With 30% or so on SASSA, on the dole, and another 35-40% unemployed, who are willing to work but unemployed, perhaps either on grants or any other things, or perhaps really depending on the state to help them, whether it's medical aid or whatever it is. So you look at a country of 70% dependent on the state, and only 10% of the country contributing to the tax that helps to fund the 90% of the country. So what that has done, it has made South Africans, the rest of us South Africans, a bit lazier than we should be, and not as entrepreneurial, not as resourceful as we can be, or as we were when we fought for the struggle. But once we gained the independence, we felt that, well, we have earned this. This is ours. The state must work for me. those who can must work for me. And what that has done, it has created a scenario such that when you now have economic migrants, like for example from Zimbabwe, from Malawi, from in particular those countries who come here to contribute to the South African economy, but of course, yes, they're working for themselves to support their families back in Malawi, Zimbabwe, and other countries. When that scenario happens, and Somalia as well, for example, and the way they've done that is either they've work for somebody, or they are creating businesses, whether it's corner shops or all those things. What that's done is created an animosity by South Africans who now look at these people as taking their jobs. But the truth of the matter is nobody's taking anybody's job. It is us South Africans who have refused to accept what we think are quote unquote lower jobs. And we also think that the government must work for us and owe us. So to me, those are the two biggest problems that's facing us in terms of who we are as a continent, which then affects the common things which you would have expected from the continent. And the history of South Africa's liberation and the history of the continent, the struggle for independence for the continent, we would have learned a few things out of that. We would have learned one, humanity. The fact that a Kenneth Kaunda would sacrifice his people for your country, that says that, we care for other human beings. Also the sense of community, the fact that you have the frontline states coming together to fight for South Africa shows you that there was a sense of community. The fact that it was an AU, it was a sense of, guys, if we are going to win this, we're going to have to win it together as a community. So it's part of a fundamental culture of who we are as African. The other one is resourcefulness, creativity, that we became resourceful. We are a resourceful people. I mean, I was watching TV the other day, and some people were saying they don't get water for sometimes in the dry season for months, but they find ways to survive because we are a people who by nature are very resilient. So that resilience enable people to be resourceful as well, to find ways to survive. And most importantly, the other key trait that binds us as Africans is the sense of sacrifice, or the ability to sacrifice for a greater good, or to serve for a later good. So to me, those 5 attributes are quite key in terms of what I've learned as well from the continent, but also what will help South Africans to understand where we are relative to the rest of the continent. It starts with understanding, and it starts with putting yourself in their space. And then when you understand and put yourself in a space and you recall your history, you will understand those 5 key principles, or that attributes or traits, which is one of resilience. We're a very resilient people. Humanity, we're a very humane people. One person suffering elsewhere is my suffering. We're a communal continent, and a communal means that we come together for the greater good. We are a very resourceful people. We're a very resourceful people, and we always sacrifice for the greater good. That's what binds us as Africans. And if you understand it as South Africa, as part of our history, as part of our collective identity with the continent, as well as if you don't identify the continent, then you will not have an identity. So why are we failing with our resources? Your other questions? When we've got we're so rich in resources, the world's #1 supplier of platinum and many other resources, but yet, and we can't beneficiate. Well, there's examples. For example, if you look at Botswana, where they brought all the operations into Botswana to speak to the idea really that we can mine them here, cut them here, polish them here, and design them here and sell them to the world. So that's an example that it is possible. The second example is now with the Africa Free Trade Continental Area Agreement, which came into effect 2020. When it is really at its best. Right now it's at its best in theory, but when it's at its best in practice, we will then begin to see the ability of Africans to create businesses and brands which are able to move around the continent, and we then will be able to go back to what we did well as Africans, which is the concept of bartering. That I will focus on doing XYZ and you do XYZ, and we so it become an economy, a much more modern way of bartering, but on the principles of an African thing that still happens in places like Togo, for example, where they meet on the market and they'll barter. They say, you grow this, I make this, I build this, let's share, and then we do this. Obviously, AFCFTA will make it easier to be able to move that across borders.
I like that you speak about our resilience, humanity, which really speaks to Ubuntu. I know the word has been overused and misused many, many times. However, in my observation, when I read about the different countries in Africa, when I meet different people from different parts of the continent, I find that sense of humanity when we are not fighting for our survival is something that is common amongst us as Africans. And I truly believe that if we were to remember our sense of humanity, and I think perhaps if we were to remember to take pride in who we are, we would achieve so much more as a people from the continent, remembering the value we bring to each other, and perhaps also not using simple things like the type of clothes we wear. Why is it that our fabrics, our style, our fashion is reserved for Heritage Day, for instance, in South Africa? Why are we not able to see each other as potentially countries that we can learn from each other, that look to for solutions? I mean, you look at Nigeria, you look at Kenya, they are growing in terms of the economy, right? And yet us as South Africa, we're still lagging behind. But I think it is mostly because there is a disconnect in terms of who we are as Black people, as Africans, which kind of makes me think about Steve Biko's Black consciousness. Do you think if we were to be a bit more aware of who we are and we took pride in that, we would achieve this collective, the ability to grow together, the ability to tap on each other's resources as Africans? Do you think we'd do that better?
Of course. I mean, that is what's holding us back. What is holding us back? If you look at Europe, for example, intra-Africa trade in Europe is like 60-70%. That has enabled them to trade with each other because they understand the relative strengths that they have. They understand that Germany will offer them engineering excellence. They understand that England will offer them traditional excellence. They understand that France will offer them the romantic excellence or style or design, and they understand those are if they have those centers of excellences around the continent, around their continent, they'll be able to maximize their opportunities. So that's that, and all those are founded on what I've just said in terms of our resilience, humanity, community, resourcefulness, and sacrifice. If we build on those attributes, those three attributes, which are part of who we are as Africans, we'll be able to go much further. I think there's an African proverb that says, "You can go far. You can go." Alone you can go far, but I think together we can go further, or something of that nature. I can't remember what it says.
Yes.
But it's a beautiful African proverb that speaks to when you just come together, how much further you can go as a people and as a person as well. So I think if we build on those, we'll be able to go far as a continent. So you see all these things that I've mentioned, these 5 attributes, they've got nothing to do with money. They've got everything to do with the sense of self, of understanding who you are. You mentioned the Bikos and all those. The Bikos of all, what the Biko, for example, what tried to do is to build the self-consciousness, and that's African consciousness, that's Black consciousness, and understanding of who you are and how that on its own, it is a strength, and it is not a weakness. It is not, and the problem that we have in Africa, you spoke about the fashions and all those type of things. Fashion of Africa is that we think that, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o once remarked, we think that when we speak in better English and when we wear better international fashions, we think that's success. Whereas, as Ngugi says, the man who can speak the other language better than his home language is enslaved. But the man who speaks his language well and can speak the others as well is a man with limitless opportunities.
So in terms of that which is not financial, because I think we tend to use money as a reason for not doing many things, right? What are the traditional or religious or spiritual practices that you have observed across Africa where you find similarities in what we do? Is there a common thread of, how we see a human being? Because I know in most African countries, we believe that there's a spirit behind this body. How have you observed different practices?
Well, I mean, maybe there's two parts to it. The first part to it is, if you will, the formal spiritual outlets called religion. And you look at the continent as a place where big numbers, a third or so are Islam, and another third, perhaps another half, maybe Christianity, and a whole lot of others maybe believers in something. So that's a part of formal spiritual outlets. And then you've got the traditional spiritual outlets. So anything that is done by an African is looked at as boloi, or something that is not, if you will, that should not be celebrated in public. If a credo mutua, for example, people look down on Credo Mutua because he speaks more from an Afrocentric perspective, from traditional practices, from where we come from. You look at Kotwasa, for example. So to me, that's the second part, which is the traditional expression of spirituality, if you will, because we believe that's what heals, that's what renews, and that's what fixes many of the problems. And then perhaps the third one is just a general belief that there's a higher being, and a higher being that explains the state of the world and the state of being, and should be acknowledged. So that's sort of how I look at it. If I go through the continent and I've seen how, for example, religion sits side by side with traditional practices, and are not at conflict, and one is not looked down at all.
The world is overpopulated, and Africa is the fastest growing population. I think in the next decade or so, we will be having major problems with climate change, how we handle the earth and its resources is obviously problematic, as we have come to understand. But from different material I've read, I've come to understand that Africans at some point observed nature and respected the earth. And so they saw this relationship between the earth and communities. Do you think there's an opportunity for us to find that again by going into who we are as a people, looking at our traditional practices, how we used to plan our agriculture, how we used to treat livestock, how we used to not necessarily take more than what we needed as communities? Do you think we are being presented with an opportunity to do things differently? Do you think there are solutions we can offer the world in terms of who we really are, not who we have been colonized to believe we are? But if we were to go back to how our forefathers lived in communion, or this relationship between people and nature and how nature was respected. Do you think there are any opportunities that exist there for us to change the narrative?
The difficult thing that we're facing now as the world, not just as Africans, but unfortunately as Africans as well. If you look at Africa, for example, we've got incredibly arable land, but we don't have the skills. We used to have our traditional skills of how we used to deal with the land. But unfortunately, greed has overtaken. Greed and ignorance have killed us. Because from a greed in terms of, like you said it earlier, that we are taking from the earth more than we're giving back to it. Ignorance is in that we do not know, we have lost an understanding of sustainability in terms of the relationship between man and nature. Or how to live in harmony with nature, because if we destroy nature, we'll never be able to fix it. We'll never be able to fix it again. And that's the challenge that we're facing right now, that we really need to fix our relationship with nature, because it's not just about food on the table when you fix nature. But remember what nature provides us, the air that we breathe. It provides us sustainability for the fauna and the flora, the animals that roam the street, that keep our nature where we are and enable humanity to exist. So right now we're at a crossroads where as a continent, if we don't reclaim our land, particularly because we still have a bit more land than anybody else, if we don't reclaim our land and protect our nature and nurture our nature rather, we are going to be in trouble. Of course, we can teach the world. We can teach the world only if we are confident and we don't look down at who we are and where we come from. The challenge we face now is we've looked at everything that we are as primitive.
Over the years, you have worked hard at speaking positively about the continent, and not only speaking about it, but you've been involved with starting initiatives such as Africa's Best Brands and Buy Africa, Build Africa. And you recently launched Africa's Best Places, which is an initiative aimed at recognizing and ranking the best places in Africa. What has that been like, and what were your key learnings from those different initiatives?
Well, I've learned one thing important. What I've learned over the years about our relationship with brands in the continent, for example, when I started the survey in 2012, Africa's Best Brands, certainly in 2012, and up to now, in the 12 years or 10, 12 years, I've learned a couple of things. One, I've learned that 20% of the brands that Africans admire, and only 20% of the brands that Africans admire are African. So it means that there's an 80% opportunity for us to turn around this opportunity. And if we don't believe in ourselves, we will not be able to believe in anything that is made in Africa. And we reject a lot of times the made in Africa narrative. And I think this study has shown in many ways that there is that wholesome rejection of anything that is made in Africa. So I've learned, so that's why I've gone on this journey now. I've said the journey that I've gone on now. So on the travel has exposed me to even the state of brands in the continent. So I can tell for sure what I've seen, what I've read, what I see people consuming, what I see them celebrating, how I see them adorning themselves. So to validate what I now looked at scientifically from my research, that 20% of the brands that Africans admire, that only 20% of the brands that Africans admire are African. That's rejection of who we are as Africans. So we need to fix that. We need to fix who we are as a people. We need to fix we need to go back to what made us Africans. But we also need to understand that we cannot beat Italians at being Italian, French at being French, and English at being English, or Americans at being American. We can beat them all on how to be African. And in order to beat them at being African, you must first accept that you're an African and celebrate Africa and understand that Africa is not inferior, it is different. Just as England is not superior, it is different from the rest of the world.
That is so powerful. I'm amazed by the fact that you mentioned the word reject. In the work that I do, I'm a healer, I'm a trained sangoma, I realize that a lot of people reject themselves and are seeking external validation. And this is what I'm observing from us as a collective, as South Africans, particularly young South Africans. You look nicer when you are wearing a European brand. You look this when your success is in relation to American standards and so on. So it's quite interesting that you use that specific word, because I think it is very fitting for where most young people are. I feel that a lot of the time we reject ourselves in so many ways. We think we are not good enough, and as a result, we don't even bother to do what we think we are capable of doing. Yeah, so that's a very interesting observation, I think. Thank you so much, Thebe, for being with me during this conversation. I think what I would like to ask you, my final request is, what would you say to any young African? How do they take pride in who they are? How do we fix this? And I know there probably isn't a quick fix solution, but where do we start?
I think to me, it starts by buying a mirror. So every single African needs to buy a mirror and look at themselves and reflect on themselves and reflect on who they are. They need to get deeper into their souls and understand what makes us who we are. And they need to accept that. They need to accept that we are Africans. But I think most importantly, they also need to get out of their comfort zone, out of their homes, and get to see the rest of the world, of the continent particularly, and to try and see what binds us, what unites us as Africans. Because I think it is Kwame Nkrumah said, the forces that unite us are greater than the forces that divide us. So if we can understand that forces that unite us, we'll be able to go far as a people. And finally, by understanding that our success, our success as people will only be greater if we work together.
Thank you for sharing your time with us today. I truly hope you learned something new, felt something, and were inspired to cultivate a more conscious life. I'd love to connect with you, hear your thoughts and story. Please feel free to reach out. Our contact details can be found on montcm.co.za.
You've been listening to another production from Solid Gold Podcasts.